Anthony Julius, a very esteemed scholar and lawyer in England. And we're discussing today his extraordinary book, Abraham the First Jew, which is published by Yale University Press. And in the chat, there should be a button to order it on Amazon if you are so inclined. I recommend it highly because it was extremely fascinating work, a work that weaves in and out of the Jewish canon, and on the other hand, fills in and embellishes and enriches the story of Abraham and its valence in the Jewish world. So thank you, Mr. Julius Anthony, and welcome to the American Jewish University Wisden Center for Open Learning.
Thank you very much.
As I said, I don't want to gush too much, but I was fascinated by the work. I was fascinated by its erudition. I was fascinated with its sort of ground of being, because you take the biblical account, you shuffle in certain extra biblical traditions, which are nonetheless very canonical about who Abraham is and what his function is, and extra facts about him, and you come to some extraordinary conclusions which have valence throughout subsequent Judaism. So I wanted to ask you about that. You begin, if we, pardon me for being linear, but beginning at the beginning, you really talk about Abraham's life in Ur, and you sketch out the nature of Ur and its cosmopolitanism. Could nearly, what is it, 3,800 years ago or something like that?
Yes.
It's extreme sophistication of certain types in certain ways, and detail Abraham's function there. And at the beginning, I think you really take Maimonides' understanding that Abraham is sort of the first philosopher. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak about the book, and thank you very much for the very thorough and patient reading that you've given to the book, as well as, of course, for the endorsement. I very much appreciate it. The two separate points that you've raised, let me take in turn. First of all, the character of Sumerian society of Ur, in which Abraham is born and brought up, and then secondly, his claim, or the claim that's made on his behalf, that he is the world's first philosopher. So as far as Ur is concerned, there is a common understanding that Abraham's society was, so to speak, thin and stupid. That he was living in a society of imbeciles who, of course, typically mistook bits of wood for divinities, and there is a kind of profound distaste and contempt for that society, which comes through in the tradition, so to speak. So what I wanted to do was to correct it for three reasons. First of all, because it's just not true. We know that the society was an exceptionally complex and sophisticated society, highly literate, and kind of socially intricate, with distinct classes and each class with its own role. I mean, highly hierarchical and with very little movement between the strata in society, but nevertheless, a society of some complexity. So that was the first reason. I just wanted to, if you like, correct the Jewish understanding. The second reason is that I think it's actually much more interesting to think about Abraham as rejecting something which has its own appeal, because the kind of society in the received understanding that Abraham rejects is a society that everyone would reject.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing special about Abraham. I mean, you look at those received traditional accounts and you think, well, you know, who would put up with this Narishkeit? Who would put up with this nonsense? So that was the second reason. The third reason, in terms of the actual content, I thought it was very interesting to think about how a person might step by step work his way through careful thought and pondering an opening position, which we can just call broadly polytheistic, to a provisionally final position, which we could call monotheistic. And that seemed to me to be a journey worth considering. So for those three reasons, I took Sumerian society seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as the claim for Abraham, I make the claim for Abraham being the first Jew for the kind of rabbinically sound reason, I believe, that the mitzvah, the commandment of circumcision, is the first confessionally specific, Jewishly specific commandment. We know there are the 7 commandments given to Noah after the flood, but those bind the whole of humankind, set up courts, don't be cruel to animals, and so on. But Brit is the first Jewishly specific commandment. So the first Jew for sure. The first philosopher, well, if you take the periodizing that I adopt, then who knows?
Yeah.
In a way, it's not something that I care to investigate, because what matters for me is his priority within the Jewish tradition rather than some kind of one-upmanship generally in relation to Abraham and the world.
Okay. But first of all, by your leave, I'd like to, I'm going to share my screen. There's the book itself. And in order to set us a little bit in the mood, this is a headdress from what they called the death pit, where people apparently were either sacrificed or buried en masse or it's from the British Museum, and one of my favorite corners of the British Museum since I was a little boy. And this is a headdress from the period. So lest we think that Sumer was some sort of unsophisticated and technologically backward world, it certainly wasn't in that regard. Now, you do incorporate then 2 major traditions, one of Abraham debating the king of Ur, Nimrod, and his brother Haran, I think, being thrown into the fire, into the furnace in his place. Abraham is tested in the furnace. The image of the furnace, of course, later appears, well, it appears in the book of Daniel. It may, the ascription to Abraham may be later than that. So testing in the furnace is one image. And then the famous image of the idol shop and the idol merchant, which is taught as canon to Jewish school children. And they say idolatry is the sine qua non of beginning to be a Jew, is to not worship idols. We teach them that from the 3rd grade, generally. Also, I might add, in the 3rd grade in Israel is when they first are told the story of the binding of Isaac. And special directions go home to parents on that day and say, they're going to study tomorrow the binding of Isaac, and your child might be traumatized, and you might have to talk them through it, et cetera, et cetera. So certain elements of the Abraham story are engraved into the consciousness of Jews to begin with. Now, in that regard, when you examine Abraham's test and also Abraham's relationship with his father Terach, you viewed his in a certain way. I don't know if you'd call it an Oedipal tearing away, but there's really some rupture in their relationship, which is going to presage his eventual rupture with his wife and children. Um, uh, and do you have any?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So what I imagine is that Abraham thinks his way out of his polytheism towards an abstract conception of one God. He depopulates the heavens,
Mm-hmm.
and there's just one God left, who he speculatively um, uh, assumes is in charge, but he doesn't really know, or he doesn't have any grounds for concluding that this one God is interested in the affairs of the world, or certainly benevolently interested in the affairs of the world. He just doesn't know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he's as excited, perhaps he's more excited about the journey that he's been on, the intellectual journey that he's been on, than the conclusions he's come to.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to share um, both the process, the what we might call the thinking for yourself process, as well as the provisional conclusion that there's only one God. He wants to share this with his fellow citizens of Earth. First of all, he shares it with his wife, Sarah, who, through her own journey, has come to similar conclusions independently of him. But he begins to talk then to his family and then to the priestly class in society. And he starts to stir things up. He becomes what is now called a public intellectual.
Mm-hmm.
He aims to speak truth to power,
Mm-hmm.
to expose the hierarchies of authority which start terrestrially and then go up to the heavens.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to expose those as based on a misunderstanding about how the universe itself works. And he starts to make trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And that troublemaking becomes disruptive of his family life in the life that they lead in the society in which they're living, and it then is disruptive of the generality of the citizens who come into contact with him, and this threatens Abraham's family's standing, and they become the object of a certain amount of hostile attention. So Terach, Abraham's father, for him, it's all about the prestige of the family and the
Mm-hmm.
position of the family. Goes to the ruler Nimrod and says, "I know you're getting a little exasperated with my son. Let me help you deal with him, and you will help me at the same time. Arrest him, bring him to the palace, confront him with his subversive and empty talk, and bring him round." And so, that's what happens. And they have a long debate, and it goes back and forth. But at the end, it's clear that Abraham has the upper hand. He gets the better of Nimrod. And this is a huge humiliation for Nimrod, because he's a person of immense self-confidence and a utterly iron conviction of his own authority and superiority to everyone else. and Abraham exposes him in front of his courtiers and others in the palace. So Nimrod condemns him to death in the furnace. And this is a late image from another religious
Yes,
tradition.
this is a Muslim image from Persia of
Yeah,
Abraham in the furnace. And here is one from medieval, I believe, I'm not sure of the original text, but it's actually sort of towards a bird's head sort of, or griffin kind of portrayal of people in some Jewish text.
yeah. So shall I carry on with the story?
Well, yes, I think that we have it ends with Abraham's exile, and I did want to point out that you point to two basically epochs in Abraham's life. An Abraham one, which is a kind of triumphalist epoch where he goes from strength to strength, where he goes from Ur into Haran, into Canaan, sheds his father, wages war on behalf of his hapless schmendrick of a nephew, Lot. Lot has his own travails in the destruction of Sodom and all that kind of thing. But Abraham is sort of triumphant, and then at a certain point, it begins to unravel. As the story of David begins to unravel up, he's a polymorphous hero up to the point of the affair with Bathsheba, and slowly he begins to crumble as a personality until by the time the revolt of Avshalom, he's a broken old man. Here also, there's an Abraham 1 and an Abraham 2, and as you call them, and you also point out that that Judaism is full of dialectics, and you later create another kind of dialectic, one kind of Jew versus another kind of Jew, and you show how the qualities of Abraham infuse them both. So it's quite brilliant and encompassing as a portrayal, and very impressive to me as a somewhat Jewish scholar. So that's where you go with it. What does that notion of the Abraham 1 and the Abraham 2 come to teach us?
So Abraham 1 is the Abraham of and he is the skeptical, interrogating advocate of thinking for yourself, following the argument wherever it takes you, breaking idols, scoffing at anything which is just ready-made or inherited and not worked for through the intellectual labor of the individual. But that Abraham has a crisis in the furnace because no amount of skeptical reasoning will come to his aid. And in the furnace, not really knowing whether he's going to be answered, he turns his eyes heavenward and petitions God, asks God to save him. At the same time, Terach is pleading with Nimrod, let him out, don't let him die, we'll all leave, we won't be a problem for you anymore, we'll go into exile, just don't let my son die. And Nimrod agrees. Abraham is certain that it's God's intervention, not his father's petitioning, but God himself. Abraham thinks Terach is the man who has, in effect, got him into the furnace, but God is the divinity who has saved him. And at that point, the old Abraham, if you like, the skeptical, critical, philosophical Abraham, becomes the Abraham of faith. And he leaves for Haran, and not irrelevantly, this is where the Torah account of Abraham begins. It begins with what I call Abraham 2, the man of faith, the person who is no longer particularly interested in the exercise of his reason, but is instead committed to his conversations with the Almighty as a man of faith, subordinating himself to God's will. And sorry, shall I just finish this point?
No, go ahead. Yes, please.
You ask how this plays out. So my understanding is that duality, skeptical, thinking for yourself, critical, iconoclastic, and so on the one hand, and being a person of faith, committed to the collective, to building a nation, which is, of course, Abraham's principal task. On the other hand, these two elements run through our lives as Jews, each one of us, and we lurch from skeptical, critical positions, somewhat distancing ourselves from what we understand to be the generality of the Jewish community. We become impatient with what other Jews think or say, the restraints on our own imagination as a result of being members of any particular shul or any particular Jewish organization, on the one hand. On the other hand, we are all invested in our membership of the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, and we fully regard ourselves as Jews among Jews. So we try endlessly and fail to find some equilibrium, some point of ideal combination of those two sides. And in the attempt, essentially, we relive the trajectory of Abraham's own life.
I see. Now, when Abraham becomes the man of faith, of course, at that point, and here he is in the Byzantine inscription entertaining the three angels, he also has an ascending level of tests that prove very destructive to certain things. He has first the command of circumcision. He has the promises made at the Brit Ben HaBetarim of the future of his family and his children, and also a prophecy of the descent into Egypt. He has the War of the Nine Kings to save his hapless nephew Lot, and eventually he has the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, all of which serve, and this, you were very blunt about this, to destroy his relationship with his wife Sarah. That his wife Sarah recedes from mere cynicism to basically self-destruction over the course of Abraham's growing challenges of obedience. Would you say that?
Yes. I mean, I was very interested in charting the collapse in their marriage, because that felt to me something which is hidden in plain sight in the canonical accounts.
Yes.
I mean, and just they're actually in the Torah.
Yes.
You don't even have to go to midrashic embellishments or elaborations. The Torah begins the account of Abraham's life by relating that Abraham and Sarah left Haran with their possessions and the souls that they had made. They were both engaged in what we would call conversionist activity. They both of them, fully as equals, were, so to speak, spreading the word of the one God. And at a certain point, when Abraham is reluctant to follow Sarah's directions in relation to Hagar, he has a vision in which God tells him, do what Sarah says, and that's because she's the superior prophet. She has a greater insight, she has greater knowledge,
Yes.
of the way things have to be than Abraham himself. So here you have this extraordinary woman of immense intellectual and spiritual qualities, who was fully Abraham's equal at the beginning of their Torah life, but treated with increasing shabbiness by Abraham.
Yes.
The incident in Egypt, and then later the incident in Abimelech, where on each occasion Abraham says, "She is my sister, not my wife," and putting Sarah in extreme peril
Yes.
as a result. In the second case, in the case of Abimelech, without even consulting with her first, and then resolving to rob her of her son
Yes.
in the Arcada without any explanation to her. And of course, what happens is she dies straight after the events on Mount Moriah.
Yes.
This is a collapse in a marriage which ranks with and exceeds perhaps the greatest accounts of collapses of marriage in 19th century literature. Anna
Yes.
Karenina, Madame Bovary, and Abraham and Sarah.
Right. Right. There's a point, you see the decline when she hears the prophecy of the three angels, and she says, "How can I have a child when my husband is so old?" And God remonstrates with Abraham, saying, "Why does Sarah say she's too old to have the child?" Well, God didn't want to make trouble by telling the truth of what she actually said. But you see her withdrawal into cynicism prior to her eventual death right after the Akedah. And Abraham, the more he obeys, the more he's cut off from relationship with his loved ones, so that when eventually when he dies, Ishmael, his other son, reappears in order to take care of the burial, and Isaac as well is striking for having simply shut down as a character and become completely passive. These things come up to the Akedah, and I have three images. This, of course, is the Tishan that you used for the cover of the book. The Akedah is such a numinous symbol for Jews, and what does that mean, that we've carried this as the quintessential moment? Why?
Because it's a knot of such perplexing fastness and intricacy that we cannot unpick it, and we cannot leave it alone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As I said, the preparation for reading the Akedah in the third grade in Israel is so, there's no question, as we might do here in America, say, well, this story is too disturbing. We're going to pass this over. We're going to take this out of the canon. We're not going to teach, for instance, the Odyssey anymore, or things that have been discussed of late in America. But in Israel, there's this, it's eventual. What does that mean for people who serve in the army and pay taxes and live in a cooperative society, that they teach the Akedah as a formative moment in Judaism? It's
not that society in particular has chosen to teach it. It's that every Jewish society teaches it.
right.
But it no doubt reflects back to each distinct Jewish society something of its own special characteristics.
Yes.
There are studies of the place of the Akedah in Israeli culture and Israeli literature. What these studies point to, as the kind of opening point is that Israeli society is a society of Isaacs and not of Abrahams.
Yes, yes, in many
And the
respects.
identification with Isaac is much greater than the identification with Abraham. And that's, in a way, it's the solution to the problem, because Isaac is simply the victim. And
Yes.
all the problems and challenges associated with an identification with Abraham are therefore avoided.
Yes. Now, in the end, you make a sweeping conclusion that really what we're presaging in the Abraham story with Abraham 1 and Abraham 2 is two kinds of Jews, and two kinds of Jews who've carried into this way. And I can't quite define them. One is the bearer of the tradition and the acceptor of the tradition and the obedient one. And then the second type is the skeptic, the philosopher, the person, therefore, who identifies fully as Judaism, even though they might really not carry any of the traditional baggage of Judaism. And you point out, you did a brief précis of Spinoza's career at one point, and it seemed to me very much that when you were describing Abraham 1, you were describing Spinoza. He had all of these ideas and then was rather surprised when he was excommunicated by the community for various reasons, because he thought he could just express his ideas freely without consequence. And it seemed a bit like the way you just described Abraham 1. How would you summarize these two kinds of Jews?
So the book is a book of 5 chapters and a coda, a kind of long postscript.
Yes.
The first chapter is about Abraham in Ur. The second chapter is Abraham's crisis in the furnace. The third chapter is essentially the Abraham of the Torah account, a series of adventures and experiences, each of which have their own significance and meaning. And the fourth chapter is the chapter of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac, which is Abraham's second crisis, or the crisis of the second Abraham. Then chapter 5 is how that works itself through in Jewish self-understanding. The postscript then asks a related but different question, which is, what has been in the history of the reception of Abraham? What have been the major ways of thinking about Abraham, particularly within the Jewish tradition and responsive to the Jewish tradition? So I identify these categories. First of all, the rabbinic tradition. And the rabbinic tradition, which is the earliest, is still with us. There are books being written about Abraham now that are still very much within that tradition. It's a living tradition. It's still a creative tradition, and it's with us. Then there are 3 challenges to that tradition. There is the challenge of Christianity, which appropriates the binding of Isaac as a prefiguration of the crucifixion. And I talk about that. I'm not very happy with that. I discuss it. Then there is the Enlightenment appropriation of the story and a very disparaging treatment of Abraham, the Abraham of faith, the Abraham of the Akedah. Essentially, the argument is, we do not want to be that kind of person, the person who subordinates his moral instincts and his moral autonomy to the commands of another. And then there's the academic account, which essentially treats the story as a kind of rather incompetently knitted together miscellany of different narratives, and so those are the 3 that bracket my 2 Jewish engagements: the rabbinic one I call JR, which stands for essentially Jewish rabbinic, and the last, which is the alternative, a non-rabbinic Jewish tradition, which essentially originates in the middle of the 19th century and then runs through to today, I call, because it's so varied in the nature of the engagements, it can't be brought under a single adjective. So I call that the JX, the Jewish engagement, and within those very various engagements, I spend time talking about three. Kafka on Abraham and Isaac, the German Jewish literary critic Erich Auerbach, who writes about the Akedah in the first chapter of his huge history of world literature, Western literature, called Mimesis,
Yeah.
and Sigmund Freud.
Yes. What I always took away from Auerbach was the notion that the Jewish model was to see the character evolve over time, to run from Abraham 1 to Abraham 2, to go from heroism to brokenness, as with Abraham and King David. Whereas with Odysseus's scar, as Auerbach points out, the Odysseus who presents his scar to his old nurse is the same Odysseus who fought at Troy. There's no he doesn't evolve at all in that regard. Yes, I took many lessons and have much to ponder about just everything in terms of this book and about our very Jewish identities, which are always up for revision. I want to now pull an ambush that I did warn you about before. And I wanted to point out that you were I don't know how, the technical terms in England, but you were the main defense attorney in the famous lawsuit on Deborah Lipstadt, the Holocaust historian, by David Irving, the renowned anti-Semite, and you in a trial which really riveted the world, and eventually produced a 350-page response from the judge. You really were sort of very, I don't know how to say this except fawningly, really a heroic figure in the defense of Judaism, the defense of Jewish memory. Based on that, and with the apparatus of Abraham, what is our role in this present impasse? We have to accept that the people Israel is under siege right now in various ways, and that perhaps some of its wounds are self-inflicted. But but the conscious upsurge of anti-Semitism in various civil Western societies, could you have predicted that the things that the contrivances of David Irving would become more mainstream? Could you have predicted that anti-Semitism, which we defined in three ways, religious, economic, and racial, has now morphed into new forms? What words do you have for us going forward, having struggled in both these areas, in the contemplation of the Masorah and on the battlefield?
So it's a big question.
Yeah.
After the case, I spent some time writing a history of anti-Semitism in England, and I published it as a long, big book called Trials of the Diaspora, about 10 years after the trial. And it's available to be read. It's 900 pages long, so probably to be read across long winter evenings when there are no other distractions. But in that, I wrote about the challenges, the contemporary challenges to Jews, coming not so much from the neo-Nazi right, which is where Irving was to be situated, but from a combination of Islamist and communist collapse, progressive groups. And that's pretty much, I think, where we are today.
Mm-hmm.
So not that much has changed in that respect. What has changed is the nature of the Jewish world's engagement with it. It seems to me to be a world which is rather more fractured in some ways than the time that I was writing. There are intensifications of identification, particularly since 7th October. We were speaking about before this broadcast began, people refinding a sense of their own Jewishness in response to that recognition of Jews being somewhat embattled, and other Jews contemplating the devastations wrought in Gaza, and a sense of the intractability of the dispute on the ground, a land and a national struggle between the Palestinians and the Israelis, as well as all the irrational horrors of the anti-Semitic dimension, and there's a recoil in the Jewish world as well. Now, how that will play itself out over the next decades, that for me is the novel question.
Mm-hmm. And that's what, and in a way, then in your enormous history, you did sort of presage you saw some of it coming, in other words, right? I mean, was part of you unsurprised about what's been going
on? I mean, I don't claim any prophetic abilities. I just identified the conjuncture that we were in then, and we still are in.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah. Okay, we have a few questions before we wind up. Um, I was taught that Abraham was the most important Jew because he was the first monotheist. Do you agree with this teaching?
Yes, I mean that's the case. That's the case that I make.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, absolutely.
Would you consider the command and obedience of Lech Lecha, go from your father's house, from your birthplace, from the place to where the place I've commanded you, to be the first of the ascending tests of obedience? Well, I read the book, and I think that would be the case, right?
I don't make a great deal of the 10 tests. It seems to me to be a kind of not very helpful grid put over the complexity of Abraham's life. And I think about his life in a somewhat different way. But the rabbis themselves can't quite agree on the content of the tests, and there is some divergence among them on which was the first and which was the last. But I mean, plainly, if you suppose that Abraham exiled himself once from Ur to Haran, a command then to leave Haran and to go to an unknown destination because Canaan is not identified in
Right.
the Lecha command, would certainly be a challenge to anybody.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The collapse of the marriage between Abraham and Sarah exacerbated by Abraham returning to Keturah or Hagar. Keturah is another wife. She may be the same as Hagar. She may not be. Yes, no?
Well, I'm not sure I understand that question, because I mean there is a rabbinic tradition that the person that Abraham marries after Sarah dies is Hagar. I mean,
Right.
Torah is
I'm
Hagar, but the marriage is with Sarah is of course over by then because Sarah is dead.
Yes. There's one tradition, it's in the Hadith of the Islam and also in the Midrash Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, of Abraham going back to visit Hagar and Ishmael, but Sarah commanding him not to get off his camel the whole time. So,
Yeah. I
and
think I think I think the relationship is already in its terminal stage.
right. And finally, Why does the Torah not mark Abraham's binding of Isaac with a shalshelet to indicate at least some inner conflict? We in other places where it says it would sound like he hesitated, but here there's no shalshelet.
Well, because in the tradition, he doesn't hesitate.
Right? He gets up early.
Indeed.
Yes, he gets up early. Okay. Well, I must say, it's really an honor to speak to you of this wonderful, marvelous book and it's an honor for all of us to really listen to you, because it's of your many achievements. This is really an extraordinary piece that deserves the widest of circulation and would make a great Pesach gift for anybody. I highly recommend it, and we have in the chat the link to Amazon. Okay, The First Jew by Anthony Julius. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for the very patient and thorough questioning. I very much enjoyed the exchanges.
Thank you very much, everybody. And this
Bye-bye.
is American Jewish University Open Learning.